In this section we're going to look into the Detail tab and particularly concentrate on sharpening images. Now you can see the picture that I've opened up to demonstrate this, and I sit back here thinking, where do I start with this can of worms? I think I'll start by saying this, that I now use a camera that records 20 million pixels, and it's very rare for me to sharpen images at all. So the first thing with the sharpening controls in any software, they're not designed to sharpen an unsharp image through camera shake or because it's not been focused correctly. Our sharpness tools within Lightroom will only sharpen already sharp images. The sharpness of our images is not determined solely by getting the lens focused correctly or getting the settings correct when we apply sharpening in our software. We can imply sharpness in our images by getting other aspects of the manipulation correct. The better we've got control of our contrast, the sharper the image appears. So making sure that our images are sharp, clear and appealing may not start anywhere near the Detail tab here and the ability we have to sharpen our image with software. It may owe more of its success to what we change in the basic tab. So with that in mind, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And once again, what I'm going to do is clear away some of these panels. Now I know I've mentioned this probably more times than you'd care to hear, but if we just stop for a moment and look at the screen we're viewing this image on. I'm viewing this on a 27-inch monitor. It's quite a nice, large, flat screen monitor. But what proportion of the screen is my image taking up? I would say probably less than a third, but it's certainly no more than a third. So I can't overemphasize sometimes. It may take a couple of seconds to shut these panels down. And if we need to go to our history, then leave the panel on screen. But if we don't for a little while, then it's going to benefit us, I think, to have a nice large image to view. We do our best work when we can see clearly. And what better way to demonstrate that than in a tutorial where we're going to be ultimately talking about sharpness. So it's not going to take us too long to manipulate this image. Let's look up at the histogram. We can see we've got a fairly good spread of tones taken in dull conditions, but that's probably pretty good for a shot like this. Not too much in the way of harsh sunlight, which is making the shadows too deep within the cracks of the paint. So I'm going to start by moving my cursor over the highlight, and if you look up into the histogram, you can see that we're highlighting the highlight section, and if I move down, we're highlighting the white section, and you can see that's where the deficiency lies. So what I'm going to do here is just move that slider a little bit to the right. I'm not going to look up at the top of the right of the screen at the histogram. I'm going to look at my picture. I don't want to go too far, but I think that looks pretty good. I could turn on the clipping warning, but I'm pretty confident that the image I've got on screen is not going to get anywhere near a problem where we're going to start losing detail. Now, of course, when I've done that, I start to lose a little bit of the impact. Although we've put some in, I want to increase that. I'm going to do that with the clarity. I'm going to step the clarity up halfway. Just click so that it jumps and I can see what it does, and that looks pretty good. Now, can you see what I mean about the manipulation here and the impact it has on our perception of how sharp this image is or was? Now I want to do something with the colour. Remember what saturation does. It takes all of the colours, no matter where we're starting from, and it applies the same increase to all of them. So to get some lovely rich colour into the blues in the centre of the frame, it massively overdoes the reds and the oranges and the yellows around the outside edge. So let's double click to reset. Let's take a look at the vibrance. Now the vibrance does a much better job of this, and I can take the vibrance to its limit and I get lovely colour coming through the centre, but I'm not overdoing those already saturated colours. In fact, that's a pretty good demonstration of the difference between vibrance and saturation. I should have found this particular image when I was recording that video. Remember too that if we want to action just one colour in there, we can go to our hue, saturation and luminance sliders, select saturation, and we can move the sliders here to give greater saturation by moving them to the right. And you can see we're given a tooltip here. It gets dull on the left and bright on the right, but I quite like the targeted adjustment tool because I can go into the blue colour, and if I want to remove saturation I can click and drag down. If I want to increase saturation I can click and drag up considerably here. So I've got to decide if I want any extra blue how much I have. But I think that's looking pretty good. I'm looking up at my histogram. So from a point of view of improving the image, we've done enough, I think, to now think about moving on and looking at the sharpness controls. So I'll close down the basic tab and the HSL, and we'll open up the detail tab. What Lightroom is giving us here with this thumbnail is the ability, as you can see, to click and drag around the image to find somewhere where we can settle and be able to make a good judgment on the sharpness we're going to put into the shot. If I click this option here, I can select a portion of the image as I mouse over, you can see. So if I wanted to pick the edge of that number down there, then I just click, and that's then anchored over here. With the nature of the content of this image, we could do that almost anywhere on the surface, but of course in some images we may want to, in a landscape for example, just reach up to the top of the image and maybe highlight a few leaves from the branches of a tree to be able to make our judgment about sharpening. I've got an option here where I can tuck this away, and if I do so, I get a little warning. See this warning here? What it's saying is this picture is way too small for you to make a good judgment, and I'll let you look at that at your own leisure on your own version of Lightroom. But basically it's saying to me you're going to need this image to be at least 100% enlarged before you can make a good judgment. So what we could do here, knowing that that's going to happen when I click the surface, there's another way we can pull into a part of the image we want to view. So to keep the panel a little bit smaller, I'll look at the image over here rather than the thumbnail, but it amounts to exactly the same thing. With the amount slider, a value of 0 turns off sharpening, so you could argue that when it pops onto the screen at 25 in this value here, that we are getting a degree of sharpness already, but that is the default setting. The other thing to remember with the sharpness controls, or the sharpness in general, is we need to keep it to an absolute minimum. If there's ever a technique within your photography that will benefit from you erring on the safe side, this is it. So if you think the sharpness looks right to you, back off a little, because most times it'll be a little bit too heavy, especially when you first start using it. I hate it when I look up on the internet and I start to read the technical explanations for these things. It doesn't help us one jot to improve our images. So the amount, I'm going to keep this in layman's terms. The amount is a volume control. It increases the sharpness in edges like that to give us the perception of increased sharpness. Let me step it across and you can see that it does that. The detail, or the radius underneath, does, I suppose, a fine tune. It determines how much of a radius this slider is going to impact on. So if that was up and that was up, you're going to get a greater effect. Let's set them back. And the detail tab, well, that should in theory be good for a picture like this that does have lots of detail. But we can also mask images when we're sharpening them too. Now if I want to mask an image, probably it's best if we look at an image a little bit later and I can see it in its entirety. I'll tell you what, let's ignore that for a moment, because we've got an image here that's probably going to benefit from an overall sharpening, and I'll find a better picture to demonstrate the masking to you in a moment or two. If we do overdo the sharpening in our images, generally speaking, it's going to be the smooth areas that we're going to see maybe a pixely effect within that area. I think skies are the sort of area that show it up most. So we need to look at those to make sure we're not overdoing things. And I suppose the real saving grace here is we're working in Lightroom. So whatever we do with the sharpening controls, we can back away from them or change them 100 times with no concern for our image quality. What I'm going to do here is step the amount up quite considerably, somewhere up here. And I'm going to ask you to look in the center of the screen here, and what we'll do is we'll double click to reset that slider, and then I'll push it up to more or less the same spot so we can see it sharpened, not sharpened, sharpened, not sharpened, and I can gradually move my slider back. I started off around the 100, now I'm on 76, 79, and what I'm doing, I'm just trying to gauge what is the maximum sharpness I can squeeze in here. I'm going to go back to 100 because of the nature of the image. I think I can get away with that. I'm not sure I'd want to go too much further, because when I start to go up any more, I do start to see some marks in the areas around here. Having said that, we are looking at the image greatly enlarged, and we are looking at an image that can possibly take some of that distortion. But let's err on the safe side. I'm going to put this sharpness to about 100, and I'm going to live with the improvements that gives me. The radius increases the pixels where the contrast on the edges is being adjusted to give us this sharpness. So if I step that up in the same way and we look in the same position, there's not a great deal of difference there. Let me shake that off again and bring it back. I don't know, it does help a little bit, and it doesn't seem to do a great deal of harm to the surrounding area, so perhaps on this occasion I'll bring up the radius a bit. Let's try the detail. Now the detail does, you can see an instant change there, but once again we're probably working with an image that can take that level of noise in this area, if you can see it, but I don't think we're gaining such an enormous amount that it's actually worth having. But when it comes to sharpening images, I think that's about as scientific as we need to get. It's not rocket science really, is it? Because we can see our image, we can see it when it's enlarged, we can then view it at normal screen size, and we have the ability through Lightroom to change our mind tomorrow and say we overdone that, let's back off, or we haven't got enough, let's give it more. So there really isn't a great deal of risk. I suppose the problem may come when we export the image, and then when we do so we're likely to be exporting it maybe to be printed, and quite often when we're printing an image we often see the image appear a little bit sharper than we perceived it on screen. That's my experience. But I think we've sharpened this image considerably, and certainly enough in my view. Now I think what we'll do here, I'm going to go down and bring back my film strip. I'm going to right click that thumbnail down the bottom there, and I'm going to make a virtual copy. There we can see a copy has been created, and it's going to show the thumbnail in a moment, but that is the thumbnail there. But I'm going to reset that to where we started, because what I'm going to suggest we do is we bring up our original, and we'll get rid of all of these panels around the edge. Shift Tab will do that for me. And I'll tell you what we'll do, we'll turn the lights out too. I'm going to hit the L key once and twice. So now we've got the opportunity to evaluate this image and the sharpness. There's the one we've completed. There's the one we started with. And the point I was making at the start was it's not just the sharpness that we've applied here that's given us probably the success of this image, the impact of this image. It's getting the tonal qualities right and the colour right. It's the perception of sharpness which we've got to work on equally as much as the sharpness itself. Not a bad example, but we need another image to look at the masking. Just remember, with that lights out option, the L key needs to be hit a number of times to come back to where we start. The first hit dims everything, the second turns the lights out, the third brings us back. It's an option I sometimes forget, but it's very good and very useful. Let's have a look at this image in relation to our sharpness. We're going to get the same options we had before. We're going to get the thumbnail where we can look. But what I'd like to do here just at the start is to show you this at the size we're currently looking at it, even despite the fact we've got our little warning there. I want to show you how the masking works. If I move my mask, nothing happens at all. But if I hold my Alt key, when I hit the mask and move it to the right, you can see what happens. The reason we have this control is because anything black will not be sharpened, anything white will. So what we can do is we can decide where the sharpness, if we're going to apply any, is going to be applied mostly. And with a picture like this, where we've got that softness around the outer edge, we probably don't want sharpness added there and down here, and some of those places in between, we need to focus our sharpness on the duck itself. And again, we would usually work the duck through the basic tab first and make sure we get the image adjusted as we see fit, because of that perception of sharpness, not just the ability to apply it here. So moving on to the image, I'll click once. There's my 1:1. Takes a second just to sharpen up again, and I'll bring it down to an area where I think I can look, and I think that's as good as any. So what I can now do is step that amount up, and I can do the same as I did before. I can concentrate on one area, and sometimes that's what I find best. I look at one particular area and I increase the amount. Let me go to the maximum here. And off, and on, and off. Would we get away with the maximum sharpness here? If you look really critical, and again I emphasize the fact you're watching a slightly compressed video, I can see a little bit of noise down the edge of the straight edges there, and a little bit here, but it's not critical given the size of the image. But once again, I'll try to moderate my demands for sharpness and keep the sharpness around about 1. Do I want to increase the radius? Well, try it and see if you can actually increase the sharpness without bringing any of the negative sides of that. And I'm not sure we can. Maybe we could pinch a little, but there's not much in it. And it's not an image which has bags of detail, so I'm going to leave that aside. Let's click once more in there, and we should reduce to standard size. I think the key to getting sharpness right is, first of all, always make sure you err a little bit on the safe side. Secondly, when you're new to these controls, open your picture up to at least 1:1 and study the image and the area you're sharpening, because once you've applied it a dozen or so times, you'll start to get used to what your lenses and your technique require, and then it becomes even easier to find the limit of where you want to move the slider to.